Till now, we have seen the formation of the All India National Congress. But we also noted the fact that this All India National Congress had only come to power or was only formed by the efforts of the early nationalists. Now, these early nationalists were also the people who were called the intelligentsia. So they belonged from an educated background, and not only were they educated, they also belonged from a wealthy background. So most of them, which is interesting to note here, that most of them were in fact the receivers of Western education. Now, these early nationalists and their methodology has often been termed as a more moderate methodology. Why so? And how exactly did they shape the coming mass movements in India that ultimately led the British to quit India is something that we need to learn today. So the early nationalists, as we were discussing, have been termed as moderates because they took to a more moderate stance of political sense. So when they started to politically organize and work towards the national movement, or they started to organize the people in the national movement, they actually stuck to policies that were more close to constitutional reforms. But you see, all these policies that they worked for was of course driven by a mandate, was driven by a set of objectives. And in order to know those objectives, we will first have to realize and answer the question as to how many phases can we divide this Indian nationalism or the movement in. So the phase of Indian national movement can be divided into three. First, the early nationalist, second, the assertive nationalist, and third is the Gandhian era. The early nationalist is often termed as a moderate phase, the assertive nationalist as the more radical phase, and the Gandhian phase is when Gandhi became the face of the national movement. The early nationalists thus were the people who belonged from intelligentsia and included people from all walks of life. So they were educated people who came from backgrounds of law, of education, maybe even backgrounds of after a point of time civil services. So these people who came forward to take to the political front actually decided to do so to create the political opinion. Some early nationalists who developed as an eminent personality and had a great impact in the national movement were, as we can see on screen, Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Firoz Shah Mehta, Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, and Justice Mahadev Govind Ranade. So all these people you see had certain methodologies that they followed, certain objectives and certain mandates that they had, which ultimately took them forward to establish a sort of political structure that would lead to discussing the grievances, first of all, that the Indians were facing, and also looked forward to placing them in front of the British. So the final appeal was to go to the British. Now, when we have been discussing about Dadabhai Naoroji's establishment and also the work and contribution that people like Surendranath Banerjee had, we have seen that these people thought that in fact the British rule in India was for good. Just that the British did not realize the native problems because they were not native residents of India. Now, Dadabhai Naoroji had the innate faith, you see, on the British that once they come to know about the problems, they will deal with it. So you can very well understand that the moderates in fact had a thought that the British rule in India was in fact for good. So the early nationalists had certain specific mandates, as we have been discussing, and they also thus have a specific set objective that they wanted to achieve. The very first point is that of home rule or self-rule. Now, the difference between a self-rule or self-governance and a home rule is necessary to be understood here, because home rule would mean that Indians would be ruling Indians, but being a part of the British Empire, the British Commonwealth. So they would be still a part of the British Commonwealth, and the British Crown would be the ultimate, administrative power, but the Indians would be still governing the Indians. But the sense of self-rule was still not inculcated in the early nationalists so, long ago when they started their agitation. Second was the fact that the acknowledgement of British rule had helped in ending various social evils like that of abolition of sati, child marriage and untouchability. As we have been discussing the fact that India was ridden with various social evils, various practices that took India many, many years backwards. And these early nationalists, being from educated background, in fact wanted to bring an end to this. So when they saw that the British came forward and they had garnered support from the Englishmen, they believed in this entire fact that the British would do good for Indians when they come to know about their grievances. Third is, the early nationalists had full faith in British administration, justice, and followed moderate forms of politics. So when we state the word moderate here, we have to then realize and take into respect the fact that their methodologies were of course very diluted, and their methodologies were after a point in fact to appease the British. So here it is important to note that when the early nationalists were taking on the Indian national movement, they had the sense that they had to trade softly with the British, because if they decided to take it up with the British in order to harm the British Empire or do certain things that would anger the British Empire, it would actually, result into something else. So what these early nationalists wanted was to in fact create a situation where they could come ahead and represent their problems. So apart from these objectives, these early nationalists, as we have seen, had a set mandate, and it was not just a 3-point program for them. There were various other objectives that they wanted to achieve, and also they had moved ahead in that path. Now if you take a look at the picture on your screens, do you see anything weird in this picture? Now this picture is of the India Council, which was meeting at Shimla in 1864. Now, if you take a deeper look at this picture, you will realize that all of these people were English men. They were all white men. So the India Council was an all-white body. So the fact that this all-white body would be governing India, would be, deciding and discussing about Indian problems, about Indian legislation, was something that the early nationalists as well did not come in terms with. Now, they wanted to change this very aspect of representation. So we come to a juncture where we are going to discuss various constitutional objectives that they had. So the first step that they took was to voice their opinion against the India Council, and therefore asked for the abolition of the all-white body. The early nationalists demanded more representation of the Indians because it was the Indian natives who were being governed, who were being discussed about. So we see that the demand was for the increase in the number of Indians represented in the bodies of power and governance. When we talk about various legislative, changes that they focused on, the first fact here is to represent oneself, because an Englishman would of course not know the problems that an Indian native was facing. It was for this basic fact that the Indian nationalists strived for the utmost representation of the Indians in governing bodies. We see that Indian civil services being opened up for the Indians, and the Indians were able to compete for the positions of governance. Thus, we can see here in the picture Honorable Lord Satyendra Prasanna Sinha, who was the first Indian to become a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council in 1909. So the Viceroy's Executive Council was again an all-white body that was to look after the governance and administration of India and was under the Viceroy. Now, it would in fact be unfair to have a body to govern over Indians without one single Indian. So Satyendra Prasanna Sinha became the first person to be taken into that, and that is because of the initial efforts of the early nationalists. At this point of time, when India was dealing with its national movement, the rising political knowledge and sense, do you know what was happening abroad in the international scene? Canada, Australia, and several other places where British also had their colonies in were actually gaining self-rule. So here in this picture, you can see the first session of the parliament in self-ruling Australia in 1901. So thus they took inspiration from the methodologies of these colonies and how they were trying to attain self-rule. So they took up the idea of no taxation without representation. So this idea was taken from the American revolutionaries who were agitating for their civil rights and their liberties at that point of time. Now, here the fact remained that the Indian early nationalists realized that representation was the most important factor if they needed to gain democracy. Now, even before democracy, they realized that the entire situation of the British in India was dependent on the economy that they derived from India. If that could be, put to effect where there is a differentiation in the economy because of no payment of taxes, then the British would automatically pay a little more heed to the early nationalists. Thus, the idea of representation was further strengthened by the nationalists by the slogan, no taxation without representation. And India was also inspired, as we saw then, by examples set by Australia, Canada, which attained self-rule under the British Empire. Thus, the early nationalists focused on the fact that without representation, they would not provide any taxes, sticking to the slogan of no taxation without representation that was taken from the American revolutionaries as an inspiration that the early nationalists drew. Thus, to quickly recapitulate the constitutional objectives, first, that they demanded the abolition of India Council. Second, they pushed for the inclusion of Indians in various governing positions, in various positions of power. And third, demand of Swarajya or self-rule, being inspired by the examples of Australia and Canada, which were former British colonies which had gained self-governance under the British. Now, at this point of time, when we are discussing about the early nationalists, it was not the legislative objectives which they just had in their mandate. We have to realize that the British rule in India did have certain implications and did have major implications on the economy of India. Now, the way the British had been ruling India had affected Indian economy, and India had a dilapidating industrial sector as well as very poor conditions of work that the peasants were working in. So we see that various economic objectives are also being included in the mandate of the early nationalists. So the early nationalists demanded the reduction of land revenue and rent to help the Indian peasants and pushed for the abolition of taxes on salt, sugar and items of daily use for the Indian masses. So you can very well realize from this basic sentence that the British economic policy had clamped down upon the basic commodities that the common man was using. So something like a salt and sugar, where the prices of commodities were increased, where Indians could not buy them anymore, had to pay more taxes, and the peasant was overburdened with such economic responsibilities. So the early nationalists made it a point to include these economic changes in their mandate as well. They also made it a point to justify the fact that the military expenditure could just be reduced and that amount of expenditure could be moved to health, because India at that point of time was dealing with various diseases, various new diseases, starting from the Bombay plague. And the Bombay plague had shown India how ill-equipped it was to deal with a disease of such stature. So here we can see that the early nationalists demanded for the reduction in military expenditure and better healthcare facilities for Indian people. Thus, we realize the fact that as and when India was dealing with these problems in economy or in society, there was a call to change the structure, change the method the society was functioning in. If you remember, India had also faced a great famine at that point of time, and that famine had famished the Indians. Keeping in mind, the way the famine had affected the people, the early nationalists called for a thorough rechecking of the causes of the famine. So they made sure that the British government not only took care of what caused the famine, but also took care of various, changes that they were to bring forward. Thus, the nationalists demanded to the British government to provide the peasants with cheap credits as well as agricultural and irrigational facilities, as well as the use of agricultural banks that would provide these credits to the peasant so that these peasants could be safeguarded against such famines that kept coming to India. So we can therefore understand that the idea of the early nationalists was therefore to deal with the economic problems that the Indians were facing as well. Now, in order to better in that prospect, the early nationalists realized the fact that without a banking system, it was very difficult for India to, take care of its economic growth. So here we see the formation of Punjab National Bank as an alternative to British-controlled bank. Now, this would be a national bank which would be controlled by the people in place of the British-owned bank, now which were not using Indian capital for Indian interests. Now, there were certain economic clampdowns, as we have been discussing, that the British issued. So when a national bank would be established, they would deal with the economic prosperity of India in a way that would not only help India prosper in its economy, but also to increase the revenues that India would gain. It is not unknown to you that for the British to flourish in the Indian markets, there was a man-made deindustrialization that the Indian markets had to go through, that the Indian industries had to go through. Now, when the Indian nationalists, early nationalists, took to working in the mass movements, in the national movement, they made sure that they brought the point of regeneration of the industries of India, of the homegrown industries of India. So they asked for British support and demanded the development of Indian coal, paper, glass, sugar, and other industries, other native industries, and also wanted the full support of the British government through protection of trade, so that India could trade openly with the international market, along with, levying heavy duties on what was imported to India, so that the homegrown markets could, gain a revenue out of the trading system. The early nationalists also focused on the use of Swadeshi products and boycotted the British goods. So we see that the early nationalists popularizing the use of Swadeshi or Indian goods. So if we quickly recapitulate the economic causes, first, early nationalists demanded the reduction of land revenue, rent, and abolition of taxes on the common commodities used by the man. Second, demanded the British authorities to thoroughly inspect the causes of famines and find remedies for the situation. Third, Indian leaders urged the British to reduce military expenditure and improve banking systems, healthcare, and education. Fourth, demanded the British government to invest in new capital oriented towards building and revitalizing Indian industries and to provide trade protection. Fifth, they popularized Swadeshi, or the use of Indian goods. As we have been discussing the fact that the entire idea of the early nationalists was to, gain apt representation of the Indians in position of power. Therefore, we can understand that their mandate also included the various administrative objectives that would bring Indians to govern the Indians. Now, the entire aspect saw a shift when we see that the Indians are being taken in the Indian civil service examination. So the early nationalists demanded the Indian civil service examination to be held in both England as well as in India, so that Indian people could compete in the administrative examination. Admissions of more Indian officials to the higher ranks of administrative services. Now imagine a position where a British cadre who is almost of the same capability of an Indian person who can administer is being given the position to administer in the Indian state, whereas the Indian who could have governed in India is not being allowed to do so. And on the other hand, the British official is being paid more and paid by the Indian money, by the Indian revenue. So in order to change that picture, the early nationalists wanted the Indians to come into the administrative services and start serving India. We see that Satyendranath Tagore becoming the first Indian to join the Indian civil services. So the administrative objectives of the early nationalists was almost twofold. How the first one focused on education and building better ideals of education for the Indians. So we see the early nationalists demanding education for Indians to improve their chances of getting established in important places in the society, in the sense that they wanted the Indians to be able to compete with the British and be equipped enough to understand and grasp the kind of political knowledge that the British had. And the second factor was that when the early nationalists kept talking about Indians being given ample representation, they also meant that there had to be decentralization of power to local governments, decentralization of power from the hands of the British. Thus, we see that greater power to local municipal bodies and reduction of government control over these bodies is also being demanded. At that point of time, judiciary was not separate from administrative ideas or administrative, outlook. Therefore, we see that the British had formed this entire aspect of clamping down on Indians through various methodologies that the Indians could not understand in terms of military, in terms of defense. So here the Indian nationalists came to the fore and discussed about the fact that the Indians should be given leverage with the judicial reforms so that they could gain representation, in fact, in the judiciary as well. So the first step of doing so was to separate executive from judiciary. Why so? The separation of executive from judiciary became very important so that the British could not meddle into the judicial affairs or take Indians into detention as and how it was being done. So exploitation was of various nature and it had various phases. When the British understood that India was not so politically trained at that point of time, because for India to gain that political knowledge, they took some time. They did devise certain plans where Indians were constantly taken into detention without even giving them a proper judicial hearing. So here we see that the early nationalists asked for reforms in the Indian police system, which had become repressive and biased against the Indians. In fact, an interesting point that is to be noted here is the police and the military services that the British established in India were formed by the Indian soldiers. So it was almost like a brother fighting a brother after a point of time. So here the early nationalists wanted to change that picture and bring in a police force that was beside the Indians for the Indian cause. So can you tell me who was the first Indian to join the Indian civil services? Was it Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopalakrishna Gokhale, Satyendranath Tagore or Madan Mohan Malviya? The correct answer will be Satyendranath Tagore. So let's quickly look at the administrative objectives and try and recapitulate it. The first was that the early nationalists demanded that the civil service examinations be held both in England as well as in India. Second, worthy Indians were to be appointed in higher positions in the administrative structure. Third, they demanded government-aided education. Fourth, greater Indian representation in local government bodies as well as an autonomy for these bodies from central governmental control. And fifth, a separation of the executive and judiciary and overhauling of the existing police system that was being over repressive over the people. So the civil liberties were also seen as a major tool for the Indians that was to be given to the Indians. Now, in order to safeguard the civil liberties, the early nationalists also came up with certain other programs. So we see that Indian freedom of speech had been restricted by the British, for instance, by passing the Vernacular Press Act, which led to a discontinuation of a lot of papers which had been doing journalism about what exactly was happening in the country. So, various papers like the Bengali edition of Amrit Bazar Patrika was also discontinued under the Vernacular Press Act. In order to restore all this, the early nationalists stated that freedom of speech, freedom to form association, as well as freedom of press was to be given to the people so that they could mobilize in peace. So in conclusion to whatever we have learned about the programs of the early nationalists, civil liberty objectives played an important part in giving the powers in the hands of the people. So the first was that the early nationalists worked for providing Indians with greater civil liberties to allow them to gain a better treatment at the hands of the British. Second, nationalists called for the abolition of restrictive laws like that of the Indian Arms Act, Vernacular Press Act, as well as the Preventive Detention Act. Third, they demanded for the restoration of freedom of speech, freedom of press, right to assemble and form associations. Thus, we realize that the early nationalists had set a working mandate which would give to its people, all the tools that were necessary to, gain the power of self-realization, and also to understand that they could agitate against the British in a more peaceful manner by not only protesting but also stating the problems that the Indians were facing under the governance of British.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So, at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So, register for free now.